For months, there had been speculation about Russia preparing a fresh offensive in eastern Ukraine. Now, it seems like the renewed onslaught is already underway. As Ukraine faces intensified attacks, its allies are meeting again to coordinate further support for Kyiv. NATO members and other allies of Ukraine are gathered in Brussels for talks aimed at providing more weapons to the war-torn country. At the moment, Ukraine is on the back foot on parts of the eastern front, at least, with Russia claiming success around the city of Bakhmut. Although experts say a Russian victory in Bakhmut would not have a strategic impact on the war, Kyiv has fought tooth and nail to keep it. The battle for the city has become an example of why Ukraine needs newer, better weapons. Tanks are among the weapons Kyiv campaigned for most heavily. On Tuesday, Norway pledged another 8, adding to dozens already pledged by the West. As the conflict approaches what may well become a critical phase of the war, those tanks are getting closer to making an appearance on the battlefield. DW's Alexandra von Nahmen reports from Poland, where Ukrainians are training on the German-made Leopard 2.
Leopard 2 tanks in action, showing what they are capable of at a military site in western Poland. The first Ukrainian soldiers have started to train here. Krzysztof Sieradzki is one of their instructors.
We don't need to motivate the soldiers at all. In fact, we have to hold them back a bit, to let them learn bit by bit. They are highly motivated and want to learn everything needed to operate the tanks.
Normally the training takes 2 months, but the instructors here say they can cut it in half. The Polish government has been one of the staunchest supporters of Ukraine, calling time and again for deliveries of more advanced weapons. President Andrzej Duda himself has come from Warsaw to visit the training center.
We hope that these modern weapons will help them strike back against Russia stronger than before.
Considered one of the best tanks in the West arsenal, the Leopard 2 is also one of the most widely used. That makes him such a good fit for Kyiv. Experts say tanks alone wouldn't be a game changer on the battlefield, but they could help Ukraine to go on the offensive again.
Only days ago, Major Vadim Hodak and his tank brigade were fighting on the front lines in the Donetsk region. Now they are here in Poland.
I think these tanks will be a great help and great support for our army. When we learn how to operate them and begin using them in battle, this will have a big impact.
Ukraine has been waiting for Western tanks for months now. The first ones are expected to arrive on the front lines at the end of March.
For more on the military situation, let's bring in Justin Crump. He's a military analyst and CEO of the intelligence consultancy Sibylline. Welcome to DW. I'd like to talk about the tanks heading for Ukraine in a minute, but first, what is your understanding of the situation in and around Bakhmut tonight?
Obviously, the city is increasingly coming under pressure. I'm aware we've been saying that for weeks, if not months. The Russians obviously have launched their overall offensive. It's kind of slow but steady. Their progress is slow, but they are closing in on that city, and they've been taking villages north and south of it. It's not fully cut off, but obviously they're carrying on focusing on that area. And the aim throughout, I think, has been to try and get Ukraine to bring more reserves into the fight around Bakhmut, in as much as that town has any strategic value. But that's the only thing the Russians can really do, is bring the Ukrainians in, try and cause some casualties. But as we've seen, Ukraine's not had to commit all its reserves. They have people training in Poland. They have people training in the UK still. So the Russians haven't succeeded in that objective of stopping the Ukrainian army from being able to generate its own forces. So nonetheless, while they might take the city, they probably failed in their main objective, which was to destroy the Ukrainians there and delete combat power from them.
Is that area an exception, or are Ukrainian forces on the back foot across the Eastern Front at this point?
To varying degrees of on the back foot. I think it's a negative way of putting what's a slow loss of ground where Ukraine is losing ground, and they're making the Russians pay for the territory they're taking. That's very much the Ukrainian strategy at this point. I think it's to make the Russians bleed out for every mile they take, hope to absorb this Russian offensive, limit the sort of losses in territory made. But the real aim, actually, by both sides at this point, is to try and write down what their adversary has. So they want to cause casualties on each other to a high extent. They want to destroy enemy equipment on both sides, with that aim really of fighting one side or the other to a standstill. So Ukraine applying that as well by falling back, trade that space, and get Russian casualties effectively in return for every field, wood line, building that Ukraine loses. It wants Russia to bleed for that until it reaches the point that the Russians can no longer be on the offensive anywhere. And that's when this new equipment that Ukraine is looking at, that's when they want that to enter the fight in a month or two and give them the opportunity to strike back, retake that territory quickly, like we've seen Ukraine do in the past.
Is what we're seeing right now, what the Russians are doing in and around Bakhmut, already this large-scale offensive? Because we always talk about how the value of Bakhmut is really questionable. So is this really what international analysts and the Ukrainian government have been warning about?
There could be more to come. I mean, I think what we were never going to see in this offensive was a checkered flag drop and tanks go speeding into the distance on the Russian side. The capability of the Russian military is very much less than it was a year ago in terms of individual competence. They might have more people now engaged in Ukraine, but their average standard is lower. They were able to train their units in peacetime before. They've now had to re-equip them, retrain them in wartime. They haven't reached the standard they were at a year ago. And that's all going to limit what Russia can do in terms of more ambitious offensives at this time. They could still generate some surprises, and we're looking towards Kyiv potentially as an area where Russia's gathering more equipment. But overall, I think what we're seeing is a sort of a tide of offensive, if you like, a steady pressure increasing from Russia, but fundamentally their capabilities remain small, and it's focused on capturing, as we said, a field at a time, a wood at a time. I think what we're not going to see is tanks from the Russian side advancing 10, 20 kilometers and capturing large swathes of territory at the moment. I think they're limited to this sort of steamroller of pressure, hence what we see now.
Today in Brussels, we saw Western allies talk about Ukraine's spring counteroffensive. Now, we are a little ways from spring still, and presumably they're talking about once those tanks arrive that they have pledged and that the Ukrainians are now training on. But if Russia intensifies its attacks now, Ukraine might be in for dramatic losses. Isn't there too much of a time lag between the Western promises of weapons and Ukraine actually receiving them?
I think anyone in Ukraine would say that they needed these months ago. I don't think they're too late. I think, of course, Ukraine would have liked these sooner. They'd like much more than they've received sooner than they've got it. I think they should be able to absorb what the Russians are throwing at them. Again, if you look, the Russian strategy, in as much as there has been one around Bachmut, was to try and draw tens of thousands more people from the Ukrainian military into the defense of the town. And Ukraine never quite had to resort to that. Again, they've spared people for training. As you just heard in the previous segment, tank crews who were on the front line just a week or two ago, now in Poland, training and re-equipping. If Ukraine was in really dire straits to cope with Russian pressure at the moment, that wouldn't be happening. So the fact that they're able to still rotate their units back from the front line, yes, it's desperate fighting. It's extremely hard. But Ukraine is still not under such pressure that it can't prepare for its next move at this time. So I don't think it is too late. I think for someone on the front line right now in Bakhmut, they might say it was, but it's all a matter of perception from where we're sitting. And certainly at the moment, the anticipation that we have is that the Ukrainians should be able to roll with the Russian offensive. They will almost certainly lose territory. It's a matter of how much Russia pay for each bit of that territory they lose. And then when Russia has exhausted itself, that is the time for Ukraine to push back hard. And they should, in theory, achieve much better results that way. Now, they have to hold this offensive, though, and that's the question mark we all have at the moment, is precisely, how bad will this get?
Yeah. You were a tank commander yourself. How are these Western tanks, like the German Leopards or the British Challengers, going to make a difference?
I've operated both. I'm fond of both. They are much better vehicle for vehicle than the Russian equivalents, certainly the average Russian tank at the moment that they're facing. Russia does have a smaller number of better vehicles, but the majority are older ones. And the Western tanks, the Leopard 2 and the Challenger 2 especially, were designed specifically to be better than their Russian peers by a significant margin. And we've seen that in conflicts around the world. They are better protected, they're better engineered, they have better fire control systems, they're more lethal. They have a myriad of other things that do just make them better vehicles. They are more technically complex than the ones the Ukrainians have been operating. But again, as you heard in the segment just before this, they are sending experienced crews. They sent experienced crews to Poland straight off the front line. They're sending experienced crews to the UK. And the trainers in both countries are just saying how well motivated and how experienced Ukrainian crews are. And that, as we just heard, they're having to hold them back almost to learn some of the technical aspects because they're just very keen to use the equipment. They know how to use it to fight. They need to learn a bit more about how to maintain and get the most out of it. But really, they're ready to go back with them. So it's a great piece of equipment. It's got good crews coming for it who know what they're doing. They just have to learn a bit to make it more endurable in the field because of the logistic train, the maintenance train that comes with Western tanks that are more complicated and expensive. But overall, fantastic pieces of equipment. They're not going to win a battle on their own. They're not designed for that. No individual weapon will, other than maybe a nuclear weapon. But they are really, really good for what the Ukrainian army wants, which is something that can hit hard and push the Russians back in a couple of months' time.
Justin Crump of Civil Lean, always a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.